In 1936, a lookout climbed 9 miles up a granite spine in the Bitterroots, carrying 4 months of food on the backs of 2 Forest Service mules. No road, no icebox, no neighbor for 30 miles in any direction. Just a one-room cabin on a peak, a wood stove the size of a bread box, and 100,000 acres of timber he was paid to watch for smoke. Fire lookouts lived a life almost nobody remembers now, and they cooked meals almost nobody has tasted. Number 19 was a living thing they kept alive all season long, feeding it like a pet. And number 4 was the meal they dreamed about on the long walk back down the mountain. Before we climb up into the clouds, hit that subscribe button. Let's count down 25 meals cooked alone above the wilderness. Number 25, cowboy coffee was the first thing a lookout made and the last thing he gave up. Before the sun cleared the ridgeline, he'd throw a handful of coarse ground straight into a blackened pot of water, set it on the wood stove, and let it boil until the cabin filled with a smell strong enough to wake a man who'd slept badly on a canvas cot. There was no filter, no measuring. A splash of cold water at the end settled the grounds to the bottom. A 1-pound can cost around 30 cents in the 1930s, and it had to last, so a lookout learned to make it strong and drink it black. That first cup, taken standing on the catwalk with the whole valley still gray below, was the closest thing to company he had, the ritual that told him another day of fire season had begun. Number 24. Canned Vienna sausages were the lazy supper of the fire lookout, eaten cold straight from the tin on the days when hauling wood and scanning the horizon left no patience for cooking. Small, pale, and packed in salty jelly, they sold for a dime a can and stacked neatly in a supply crate, surviving heat, cold, and months on a shelf without spoiling. A lookout might spear them onto a fork, lay them across a soda cracker, or fry them in a little bacon grease until the skin split and browned. Nobody pretended they were good, but when a thunderstorm was rolling in and the firefighter needed watching, a can of Viennas and a handful of crackers was a meal a man could eat with one hand while the other held the field glasses. They were fuel, plain and simple, the food of a long afternoon when smoke could come from anywhere. Number 23. Powdered eggs were the compromise every lookout learned to accept. Fresh eggs cracked and leaked on the trail up, and even packed in oats or sawdust, a few always arrived broken, so the Forest Service sent dried egg powder in tins, a yellow dust that mixed with water into something that could be scrambled or folded into pancake batter. The taste was faintly sulfurous, the texture rubbery if you cooked it too long, and every lookout had his own trick: a spoon of powdered milk, a hard shot of pepper, a pat of margarine to fool the tongue. Reconstituted eggs cost pennies a serving and never went bad, which mattered more than flavor when the next resupply was 3 weeks out. On a cold morning with the windows fogged and the stove ticking, even powdered eggs on toast felt like a proper breakfast. Number 22. Cornmeal mush filled the belly on the mornings a lookout wanted something hot and cheap to carry him through hours of standing watch. He'd stir yellow cornmeal into boiling salted water, whisking hard against the lumps, then let it thicken on the back of the stove until a spoon could stand in it. Poured into a bowl with a lump of margarine and a drizzle of molasses or canned milk, it was plain, filling, and forgiving. A sack of cornmeal weighed little, cost almost nothing, and kept for the whole season if the mice didn't find it. The real trick came the next morning when a lookout sliced the cold-set mush into slabs and fried them crisp in bacon grease, turning yesterday's breakfast into today's. Nothing was wasted up there, and cornmeal mush stretched a few cents across 2 meals. Number 21, fried Spam became the workhorse meat of the mid-century lookout, a rectangular can of pork that needed no ice and never spoiled. Introduced in 1937 and hauled up by the caseload during the war years and after, Spam solved the lookout's oldest problem: how to eat meat when the nearest butcher was a 2-day walk away. A lookout sliced it thick, laid it in a hot skillet, and fried both sides until the edges caramelized and the fat crackled, filling the little cabin with a smell that carried out onto the catwalk. He ate it with fried potatoes, folded into biscuits, or laid over pancakes with syrup, mixing sweet and salt the way isolation makes a man do. A can cost around $0.25 and fed him twice. On a peak in August, that crisp pink slab was the taste of a hot meal in a place where hot meals took work. Number 20, canned corned beef hash turned a tin into a skillet supper with almost no effort, which made it a favorite on the days a lookout was too tired to think. He'd dump the hash into a greased pan, press it flat, and leave it over the wood stove until a dark crust formed, then flip it in broken pieces so both sides browned. Some cracked a precious egg on top and let it steam under a lid. The salty, peppery beef and soft potato needed nothing but a fork and a cup of that strong black coffee. A can ran about 15 cents and stacked easily in the crate. Ready for the night, a storm rolled through, and cooking anything elaborate was out of the question. Hash was honest food for a hard job, the kind of supper a man ate at the window, watching lightning walk across the ridges and hoping none of it started a fire he'd have to call in. Number 19, the sourdough starter was the one thing on the mountain a lookout kept alive, a crock of flour and water that bubbled and breathed like a living creature in the corner of the cabin. Yeast was unreliable at altitude and didn't survive the trip well, so a lookout carried a starter up in a lard tin, fed it a spoon of flour every few days, and guarded it against the cold that could kill it overnight. Wrapped in a wool sock and set near the banked stove, it lived through frost and heat waves and weeks of neglect. From that single crock came pancakes, biscuits, and bread all season long, each batch tasting faintly of the last. Lookouts traded starters like heirlooms, some passed hand to hand for decades, older than the men keeping them. To let it die was a small disgrace. As long as the starter breathed, a lookout was never entirely alone. Number 18, bacon and beans was the supper that anchored the whole fire season, a pot that could simmer at the back of the stove all afternoon while a lookout kept his eyes on the timber. He'd soak dried pinto or navy beans overnight, then cook them slow with a hunk of salt pork, an onion if one had survived the climb, and whatever else the crate offered. Hours later, the beans turned creamy and the broth went thick and smoky. A pound of dried beans cost a few cents and fed a man for days, richer each time the pot was reheated. The smell filled the cabin and drifted out over the catwalk, mixing with pine and wood smoke. This was the food that built the lookouts and the trail crews and the whole backcountry, cheap and filling and endlessly patient, waiting on the stove for a man whose real job was to wait and watch. Number 17. Baking powder biscuits gave a lookout fresh bread on the mornings his sourdough sulked or he simply wanted something quick. He'd cut cold margarine or lard into flour, salt, and baking powder, splash in canned milk, and knead it just enough to hold, then drop rough rounds into a hot Dutch oven or a black skillet with the lid on. 20 minutes over the wood stove, and they came out golden on top, tender in the middle, the whole cabin smelling like a bakery on a mountain. He'd split them steaming, drown them in canned milk gravy or wild honey, or save the cold ones to carry while he walked the fire line. Flour and baking powder cost almost nothing and weighed little on the mules, which made biscuits the most reliable bread on the peak. For a man cooking for one, they were proof that even alone, a mile above the nearest road, he could still make something that tasted like home. Number 16. Stewed dried fruit was the lookout's answer to a summer with no fresh produce. A pot of dried prunes, apricots, or apples simmered soft in a little sugar and water. Dried fruit traveled better than anything, light in the pack and nearly immortal on the shelf, so the Forest Service sent it up by the sack. A lookout would set a handful to soak in the evening, cook it down the next morning, and spoon the sweet tart mixture over mush, pancakes, or biscuits. It was medicine as much as dessert, the only thing keeping a man's digestion honest through weeks of beans and canned meat, and Lookout spoke of prunes with a wry respect. The smell of stewing apricots on a cold morning was a small luxury, a bit of orchard sweetness in a place where the only trees were the ones he watched for fire. Number 15, canned peaches were the treat every lookout rationed, a heavy tin of golden fruit in sweet syrup that was too precious to open without a reason. Cans were the worst thing to haul up a mountain. Dead weight the mules resented, so a lookout brought only a few, and each one marked something: a birthday, a first fire spotted, a lonely Sunday that needed lifting. He'd work the opener slow, drink the syrup straight from the can, and eat the slippery halves one at a time with a spoon, sitting on the catwalk steps with the whole range spread out below. For a man living on dried and reconstituted food, that first bite of soft, cold, sugary peach was almost overwhelming. A taste of orchards and valleys and everything down below the timberline. A can weighed a pound, and that pound was carried up 9 miles on purpose, because some comforts are worth their weight in muscle and mule. Number 14. Bannock was the bread a lookout made when he had nothing but flour, water, and grease, the oldest camp bread on the continent. He'd mix flour, salt, and baking powder into a stiff dough, flatten it into a disc, and fry it slow in a greased skillet until both sides turned deep brown and the middle cooked through. No oven, no yeast, no waiting, just a pan and a fire. Trappers and prospectors had made it the same way a century before, and lookouts kept the tradition alive on peaks across the west. Torn hot and spread with margarine and jam, or wrapped around a slice of fried spam, bannock filled a belly fast and cost almost nothing. It was the food of self-reliance itself, proof that a man alone on a mountain with a sack of flour would never quite go without. Number 13. Cornbread came out of the wood stove golden and crumbling, a staple carried west and adapted to a cabin above the tree line. A lookout mixed cornmeal with a little flour, baking powder, canned milk, and a reconstituted egg, poured it into a greased skillet, and slid it into the oven box until the top cracked and browned. Cut in thick wedges and slathered with margarine and honey, it was breakfast, side dish, and dessert all at once. On the days he wanted it faster, he'd fry the batter into flat Johnny cakes on the stovetop, crisp at the edges and soft inside. Cornmeal was cheap, light, and endlessly useful, and cornbread gave a man a little sweetness and crunch in a diet that ran heavy on soft, salty cans. Crumbled into a bowl and covered with hot canned milk, even the stale end of a pan became supper. Number 12. Mulligan stew was less a recipe than a philosophy, a one-pot supper built from whatever the cabin still held near the end of a supply cycle. A lookout would brown a can of meat, throw in the last onion, a handful of dried vegetables, a tin of tomatoes, some beans, maybe the heel of a loaf to thicken it, and let the whole thing simmer into something greater than its parts. It had no fixed form, changing every time depending on what the mules had brought and what had already been eaten. That was the point. Mulligan used up the odds and ends before they spoiled, and it always tasted like a small victory over an empty crate. The pot bubbled through the afternoon while a lookout watched the ridges, promising he wouldn't go hungry even in the lean days before resupply. It was the taste of ingenuity, the meal a man invented out of necessity and pride. Number 11. A can of tomato soup and a sleeve of crackers was the meal of the rainy day, the storm-bound afternoon when clouds swallowed the peak and there was nothing to see and nothing to do but wait it out. A lookout would heat the condensed soup with a little canned milk to smooth its bite, crumble in soda crackers until it turned thick, and eat it slow while rain hammered the tin roof and lightning flickered somewhere in the murk. It cost a dime and took 2 minutes, which was exactly right for a day when the firefinder showed nothing but gray. There was something deeply comforting about that bright red bowl in a fog-bound cabin, a warmth that had less to do with the soup than with being dry and fed while the weather raged outside. Every lookout kept a few cans back for those days, the ones when the mountain disappeared and a man was truly, completely alone in the clouds. Number 10. Fresh fried trout was the rare gift of the lookouts lucky enough to sit near a lake or a stream, a taste of something living in a diet built from cans. On his days off, or in the cool hours after the fire danger dropped, a lookout would hike down to the water, catch a few small trout, and carry them back up to the cabin still cold and firm. Rolled in cornmeal and fried in bacon grease until the skin crackled, they were the finest thing a man could eat up there, sweet and clean and utterly fresh. Most lookouts had no such luck, perched on dry granite miles from any water, which made those who did the envy of the district. A pan of trout cost nothing but the walk and the patience, and it broke the monotony of the shelf in a way no can ever could. For one evening, a lookout ate like a king with a plate of fish he'd pulled from the wilderness himself. Number 9, fried potatoes and onions was the side dish that felt like a feast, a skillet of golden slices that could dress up any sorry can of meat into a proper supper. Potatoes and onions were among the few fresh things sturdy enough to survive the climb, so a lookout hoarded them, cooking the softest ones first before they sprouted or rotted in the crate. He'd slice them thin, lay them in a hot pan with bacon grease, and let them fry slow until the edges went crisp and dark and the onions turned sweet and translucent. The smell alone could lift a low evening. Served alongside Spam or hash or a couple of fried eggs, that skillet turned a handful of cheap staples into the kind of meal a man looked forward to all afternoon. When the last onion finally gave out, weeks into the season, a lookout felt the loss keenly, because with it went the closest thing his kitchen had to a fresh living taste. Number 8, rice and raisin pudding was the dessert a lookout made when he wanted a little sweetness and had the patience to earn it. He'd simmer rice slow in canned milk with sugar and a handful of raisins, stirring against the scorch until it thickened into something warm and creamy, then dust it with cinnamon if the shelf had any. Rice was a lookout's best friend, light on the mule, cheap by the sack, and endlessly useful, and turning it into pudding felt like a small rebellion against a diet of savory cans. Eaten warm on a cold evening or cold from the pot the next day, it carried a comfort that reached past the stomach. In a place with no bakery, no store, no neighbor to share a table, a bowl of rice pudding was a lookout's way of being kind to himself at the end of a long, silent day, a small act of comfort. Number 7, a pot of chili was the supper that warmed the coldest nights on the peak when the wind found every gap in the cabin walls and a man needed fire in his belly. A lookout would cook dried beans soft, brown a can of meat, and stir in chili powder, canned tomatoes, and a hard pinch of whatever spice the crate held, letting it simmer thick and dark through the afternoon. Chili powder weighed almost nothing and transformed the same tired beans and cans into something with heat and depth, a meal that tasted deliberate instead of desperate. A bowl of chili with a wedge of cornbread was as close to a restaurant meal as a lookout got, and on a raw September night with frost coming to the high country, it was worth more than anything a town could serve. Number 6, a bowl of hot oatmeal was the breakfast of the rain-soaked morning, the humble porridge that started a lookout's day when the peak was buried in cloud. He'd stir rolled oats into boiling salted water, cook them soft, and top the bowl with brown sugar, raisins, and a pour of canned milk, eating slow at the little table while the stove pushed back the damp. Oats were the lightest calories a mule could carry and the cheapest a lookout could buy, which made them a staple of the shelf all season long. There was nothing fancy about it, but on a cold gray morning 9 miles from another human being, that warm bowl was steadying, a fixed point in a day that might otherwise hold nothing but fog and waiting. Generations of lookouts started thousands of mornings the same way, spoon in hand at a fogged window, letting a bowl of oats tell them the day had begun, whether the mountain showed itself or not. Number 5. A Dutch oven pot roast was the Sunday supper of the lookouts who still had fresh meat left, or a good can of it, the meal a man made when he wanted the day to feel like more than a shift. He'd brown the meat, add onions, carrots, and potatoes, cover it, and bury the pot low in the wood stove to cook slow for hours while he watched the timber. Near the end, he'd drop spoonfuls of biscuit dough on top to steam into dumplings, soaking up the rich gravy underneath. It took all afternoon and all his fresh stores at once, which made it a rare event, save for a birthday, a holiday, or a stretch of loneliness that needed answering. When a man sat down alone to a proper roast on a mountaintop, there was pride in it, a reminder that even in the emptiest place in the country, he could still set himself a real Sunday table. Number 4, the first meal in town was the one a lookout dreamed about for months, the feast waiting at the bottom of the long walk down at the end of the season. All summer, living on beans and cans and dried fruit, a man's mind wandered to the same things: a thick steak, a cold glass of milk, a slice of pie made with fresh fruit, a hamburger dripping with everything. He'd carry that hunger down the switchbacks with his empty pack, mile after mile, the fantasy growing sharper with every step toward the trailhead. And when he finally reached a cafe in some small mountain town, dusty and thin and half wild from months of silence, that first real meal hit like a revelation. Lookouts talked about it for the rest of their lives, that first bite of fresh food after a summer of shelf staples. It was never really about the food. It was the sudden, overwhelming return to the world of the living, served on a plate at the bottom of the mountain. Number 3, Resupply Day brought the finest eating of the season. The morning the pack string finally climbed into view, carrying fresh food a lookout had waited weeks to taste. Down in the crates came real eggs still whole, a fresh onion, sometimes an orange or an apple, a chunk of meat that hadn't come from a can, a loaf of store bread soft enough to shame his bannock. A lookout would cook a breakfast that day, like a man making up for lost time: fresh eggs fried in bacon grease, real toast, coffee that tasted better for the company of the packer who'd hauled it up. That single orange, peeled slow on the catwalk, could be the best thing he ate all summer. Resupply Day was Christmas on the mountain, the day the outside world remembered him and sent proof, and a lookout ate every fresh bite, knowing exactly how long it would be before the next. Number 2, Huckleberry Pie was the taste of the high country itself, made from berries a lookout picked by hand on the slopes around his cabin in the last warm weeks of the season. When the huckleberries ripened in August and September, purple and tart and scattered across the mountainsides, a lookout would fill a can on his walks, staining his fingers dark, and carry them home to bake. He'd roll out a crust with flour and lard, sweeten the berries with the last of his sugar, and set the pie in the wood stove, filling the whole cabin with a smell that no can on earth could match. Huckleberries grew wild and free, gifts of the very wilderness he was paid to guard, and a pie made from them was the closest a lookout came to eating the mountain. For a man who'd spent a summer watching the land for fire, that first warm slice was a kind of thanks, the wilderness giving something sweet back before the snow came and sent him down. And at number 1, sourdough hotcakes crowned the fire lookout's kitchen, the breakfast that defined a whole way of life on the peaks. Each morning a lookout woke his starter, that living crock he'd fed and guarded all season, and stirred a scoop into a batter with flour, canned milk, a spoon of sugar, and a pinch of baking soda to lift it. He'd pour rounds onto a greased skillet on the wood stove and watch them bubble and rise, each one carrying the faint sour tang of a culture that might be older than he was. Stacked high, drowned in margarine and molasses or syrup, eaten on the catwalk as the sun burned the mist off 100,000 acres of timber, they were the finest thing a man cooked up there. Sourdough hotcakes were more than breakfast. They were the lookout's whole life on a single plate, self-reliance and patience, and a small living thing kept alive against the cold, turned to warmth on a mountaintop where a man watched over the wilderness alone. When the fires were quiet and the morning was clear, there was nothing in the world a lookout would rather eat. From that first pot of cowboy coffee to the sourdough hotcakes at the top, the food of the fire lookout tells one story: solitude, patience, and self-reliance, a mile above the nearest road. These were meals cooked by one person for one person in the loneliest job in America. Tell me in the comments which one you'd want on your plate up there, and subscribe for more.